It's a pleasure to welcome you. I'm Tom Farr, President of the Religious Freedom Institute. Welcome to the launch of RFI's new National Center for Religious Freedom Education. Since its creation in 2019, the center has been at the forefront of a movement to reintroduce into America's classrooms the true meaning and value of religious freedom as understood by America's founders. Tonight, we are pleased to announce the nationwide expansion of that movement. The center is broadening its programs and partners in order to produce a national impact on this increasingly urgent and growing national problem. The center is the flagship education team of the Religious Freedom Institute here in Washington. RFI's mission is to advance religious freedom for everyone, both in the United States and abroad. We believe that religious freedom is not a convenience, nor is it a privilege. It's an inalienable right given by God to every human being and to every religious community. We believe that every person must be free to pursue his or her religious convictions in private and to exercise those convictions in public, alone or as part of a community of believers. With America's founders, we're convinced that when societies protect this fundamental freedom for everyone, those societies prosper. When they fail to protect religious freedom for everyone in their societies, they tend to falter and often fail. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has provided some reason for hope in the decisions which impact free exercise in America, and RFI applauds those decisions and the court when they come. But we're also acutely aware that much of America's public school system, as well as other core cultural institutions of our nation, from Fortune 500 companies and big tech to the media and Hollywood and to the NFL, are targeting for attack the religious freedom of an important and highly productive element of the American religious community. I'm referring to morally orthodox Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and others whose convictions on marriage, human sexuality, the sacredness of life from conception to natural death, and the beautiful distinctions between men and women are given by nature and by nature's God. Those convictions and those who hold them have provided much of America's intellectual and moral capital for over 2 centuries. They've contributed mightily to the most dynamic civil society in history and a compassionate civil society, including faith-based hospitals, schools, homes for the poor, the aged, and the dying, and care for the orphan, the hungry, the marginalized, the dispossessed. The attack on those convictions and those who hold them is also being mounted by governors and state legislatures and by the current administration, I'm sad to say, both by executive order and by law. If passed, the ill-named Equality Act would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to subject the morally orthodox to ruinous lawsuits as if they were racists and bigots, and they would not be able to defend themselves by citing their religious freedom. Our job at RFI and at the Center for Religious Freedom Education is to defend the religious freedom of everyone in America, and that includes the morally orthodox. We deplore their stigmatization as haters and bigots. They constitute a major portion still of our population, one that has contributed much to the American democratic experiment, including their convictions concerning the truth about the human person. They have deepened that truth, but it is a truth that is now being set aside, and one which has increased the bonds of affection between us over 2 centuries. These Americans, these morally orthodox American citizens and their religious views and their religious communities, like all others in this great land, deserve the right to believe and to exercise their beliefs in our public life. Without their involvement, we're becoming a nation that believes human beings are both malleable and disposable. We've confirmed a Supreme Court justice who refuses to say what a woman is, and I fear she has some fellow travelers on the court, perhaps not only those on her side of the political spectrum, and an administration that declares men can have children. And whether Roe is overturned or not, over half, or at least half, our fellow citizens believe a woman can have neither dignity nor freedom without the right to eliminate the human being within her womb. So how do you defend religious freedom for everyone, including the morally orthodox in America? You begin by restoring to our public and private schools the founders' understanding of religious free exercise and why it's so important to our democracy. It's a fundamental right, but it's also a source of goodness and truth and reality. That brings me back to RFI's launch tonight of the National Center for Religious Freedom Education. Along with a host of partners, many of whom are represented in this room tonight, you'll hear from some of them, across the land, we're expanding our flagship programs. So let me end with 5 quick examples of the center's work. First, the center is taking our America's First Freedom curriculum, a copy of which is in the back, and its foundational principles into America's public and private schools, from kindergarten, and I mean that, from kindergarten through law school, into seminaries, yeshivas, mosques, churches, and beyond. Second, we're taking our Statesmanship and Religious Freedom Seminar for college students, held in D.C. since 2019, out of the nation's capital. This year we'll hold the seminar not only here in D.C., but also in Philadelphia, and as part of the Ministerial on International Religious Freedom in London. Third, we're launching a podcast series on the First Freedom for educators and students. Fourth, we're moving into the field of education, the center's long-standing work on the religious freedom of our healthcare providers, our doctors, our nurses, our therapeutic counselors. Finally, we're building an alumni network to feature the accomplishments of our student leaders, many of whom are here tonight. Welcome to all of you, and assist them in their careers. We are, in short, reseeding the culture. So, in sum, we believe that the gateway to retrieving and defending religious freedom, equality in America is education. And you're going to hear tonight from some of the nation's greatest experts on both. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of America's most effective leaders in this field, Mary Rice Hasson. Mary is the Cato Burns Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. She directs the Catholic Women's Forum, a network of Catholic professional women and scholars, and she co-founded the Person and Identity Project, a new initiative that equips parents and faith-based institutions to counter gender ideology and to promote the truth about the human person. An attorney and policy expert, Mary speaks frequently here and abroad on gender ideology, parental rights, religious liberty, and all the connections between them. She's frequently called upon to provide expert counsel and testimony in federal and state legislation, and in 2021, she testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee on the ill-named Equality Act. Mary Rice Hasson, as you're going to see, is a winsome warrior in the battle for religious freedom for everyone in America and abroad. I'm proud to say that she's also the deputy chair of the board of directors of the Religious Freedom Institute. Mary, please join.
Thank you so much, Tom. And it's wonderful to be here. I see many familiar faces, longtime friends of religious liberty. You know, with the launch of any new effort, even in a place like Washington, there's always the question, why? Why now? And so that's where I want to begin. What is it about our present moment that beckons, even demands, an expansion like this? The fortification, the robust efforts coming from this new Center for Religious Freedom Education. So to answer that question, I want to travel first back in time for comparison to the mid-1990s. It certainly seemed like a simpler time. It was a time when Lion King and Forrest Gump was captivating audiences in the theaters. On the basketball court, Michael Jordan still dazzled, smashing backboards and sequentially retiring and then coaching and returning to play and doing it again. The first web browser became available for public use, and clunky satellite phones were a status symbol. Hard to believe for you young people, I know. But it seemed like we were on the verge of an exciting age. And in 1994, Jeff Bezos opened a new business in his garage in Washington State. Amazon, that behemoth, was in its infancy. And we still knew what a woman was. So the political landscape, even then, had just changed markedly. From the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 to 1992, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved, communism seemed as if it had been defanged and defeated. What about religion? In spite of several decades of court cases and public tussles over the place of religion in the public square, the majority of Americans were still largely religious. So nearly 6 out of 10 Americans in 1994 said religion was very important to their lives. And a mere 5% of the population self-described as atheists, agnostics, or nuns in the sense of nothing and not affiliated. But it wasn't just religion on a personal level that was important. There was a broad cultural consensus at that time that religious freedom mattered. The freedom to search for the truth, no matter what your background, your religious belief, where your starting point is, to believe in what you've found, to live with integrity according to your conscience, and to celebrate with others the good, the God that you've found. Religion and religious freedom in all its manifestations is essential to our humanity, as well as a foundational principle of our nation. And certainly our founders recognized this, the freedom of religion as our first freedom. It's not granted by the government, because what the government gives, it can take away. It's guaranteed, practically speaking, by our constitutional protections. But it comes from God. It comes from who we are, created with that thirst for the transcendence. And in 1994, religion and religious freedom were still, by and large, recognized as unquestioned goods. Who could be against them? In fact, America, through its elected representatives, demonstrated its support for religious liberty. When in 1993, a bipartisan Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and was signed into law by Bill Clinton, the Democrat president. So it was a different time. Fast forward to today, 25 plus years on, and it's not an overstatement to say that America, in many respects, has lost its faith. And, most troubling, has lost its vision for religious liberty, at least in some quarters. So let me give you some specifics here. Religiosity is in serious decline, whereas 6 in 10 Americans used to say that religion was very important to them. Today, only 4 out of 10 say the same. People who take religion seriously, whatever your faith may be, are outnumbered in America today by those who do not. And whereas in 1994, just 5% of Americans called themselves atheists, agnostics, or nuns, today, a third of all adults claim that label for themselves. But religion in America is not only declining in terms of religiosity, religious practice, it's aging fast. So the trend towards irreligion is most pronounced in our younger generation. Across generations, it's almost as if we inhabit 2 different cultures, 2 different belief systems, 2 different value systems. And a look at the numbers tells us why Generation Z, today's older high schoolers, college students, young adults, have been dubbed by social scientists as the least religious generation in history. Professor Ryan Burge, for example, reports that when you look just at Generation Z, 44% of that generation has disconnected from or repudiated belief, practice, or connection to organized religion. That's a stunning change from 1994, when it was only 5% of the population. There are almost 3 times as many atheist agnostic nuns in Generation Z as there are Catholics. And these nuns nearly outnumber the sum of Catholics and Protestants together. So these trends are troubling, but they're going to accelerate because irreligious parents raise irreligious children. So this generational shift is something profound. And we expect in the course of a generation from 1994 to 2022 for fashion and movies and sports stars to change, and sometimes change significantly, even political regimes. But religion is something different. This is built into the human heart. We are hardwired to desire truth, to seek God. So we're hardwired for it. What is it that accounts for what we're seeing? We need religion, even when we don't know it. So this loss of religious sense, this decline in religiosity, it speaks to a poverty, a spiritual famine, really, in the hearts of our young people. And indeed, we can see by other measures that they're not well. Depression, anxiety, addictions of all kinds. This generation is burdened by soul-crushing difficulties. And yet, in their world, in their schools, in their culture, their social media, their peer groups, even many of the adults in their lives, little spiritual oxygen is offered to them to encourage them to even recognize the source of those great needs in their hearts. They don't know what to find. They don't know what to look for. So what happened? I think we have to acknowledge that for the past several decades, in spite of some progressively good Supreme Court decisions, there's been a growing hostility to religion that has pervaded the public schools' curricula and the culture, and certainly in the culture at large. It's not hidden. If you follow on Twitter, libs of TikTok and all of these teachers who are out there kind of proclaiming and boasting about not just their personal irreligious attitudes, but their evangelistic fervor to share that with the students that they teach. So what's happened is we've had this intentional sort of erasure of religion. But if the human heart is wired for that, what is it that we're teaching this generation about who we are? So a school system, a culture that ignores religion, that talks about the big things in life without ever acknowledging that there are faith traditions that have something to say, teaches a generation a deformed view of themselves, a view of themselves where the spiritual doesn't exist, where that desire for meaning is told or encouraged to find fulfillment only in the material, only in the immediate gratification. So we have an emptiness that's been replaced. And certainly we can see that, for example, in the area I work in with gender ideology. There's a willingness to believe if there is no creator, then they can create themselves. If there is no law, if there is no nature, they can decide it for themselves. And religious liberty then becomes something that gets very much in the way. So we can see that the decline of religion certainly exacts personal cost, but that's not all. Because you have a generation that has less and less familiarity with religion, less and less personal religious experience, there's a dimming of the ability to see the good that religion brings, the essential nature of religious faith, and that pursuit across all faiths for the good, the true, to contribute to that moral discourse. It becomes difficult to see that or to value it. So to some, religion becomes like a noxious habit, like smoking. Do it in private and let me know when you quit. Or, for some, it's anecdotally more just, that's the refuge of bigots. Who would want to have anything to do with that? So it's a distorted view of not just our history, but the place of religion in the life of the human person and what a flourishing culture is. We have that cultural memory, but kids who are 10, 12, 20 don't necessarily have that even to draw upon. So as a generation that has little personal familiarity with religious belief, it's not hard to imagine why they struggle to understand how conscience, for example, could compel a person to refuse to perform an abortion. If you don't know what conscience is, then it's someone else's opinion. Why can't they change their mind? Why can't they look at the facts? So there isn't that respect for boundaries, for the fact that conscience and relationship with God are not things that are given to us by the state. They come from a deeper place. So it's not surprising, in a sense. For many young people, too, in our schools, their limited education about religion, about the founding of our country, has told them a story that sees religion as a brutalizing, often arbitrary, expression of power or bigotry. The word religion conjures up images, not as it does for me of hospitals and people doing good things, but of the Inquisition and the Crusades or preachers defending segregation. They don't know the stories of how faith has inspired not just the founding, but of so much good that has happened in our country, and so much that continues to be done by people of faith, whether it's hospitals or feeding the hungry, the homeless. The donations, religious people contribute much more of their income than people who are not religious. So religion as a force for good in our society can't be replaced. It can't be substituted for by government services. But this is missing from the history and the cultural narration in our public schools and certainly our universities. But at those most formative levels, children who don't have a personal experience of religion are acquiring just a deficient vision of religion's place in society. So that brings us to where we are today. We have to shine a spotlight on religion as integral to who we are, that every person has to have the freedom to search for the truth, to discover the meaning, to follow that call that God has put on their lives, and then to celebrate what they found. We have to draw those connections explicitly between belief and virtue and what's required to live in a common society. I was struck by a comment on Monday by a newscaster when he was talking about the leak from the Supreme Court. And he said, it's as if there are no boundaries anymore. And I thought, it's exactly right. It's not like there were not rules, right, or ethical obligations that should have constrained that. There was no internal constraint. There was no sense that there's something more in our society that should be a boundary. There are places we shouldn't go, not just because we might get caught or we'll have a career cost, but because some things are right and good and true. So we have to bring back and illuminate for our young people the truth about who we are, the place of religion in the fabric of our society and the founding of our political institutions, and the primary place of religious liberty as our first freedom. So I started talking about 1994, and that's not to say we turn the clock back, but rather to acknowledge that religion and the pursuit, the desire to know the truth, is a timeless aspect of who we are. And with this new effort here, I think the National Center for Religious Freedom Education is going to play a tremendous role in elevating that concept and bringing back a richer understanding of who we are, not just the place of religious liberty, but illuminating that sense of who we are, and therefore how we can all live together in spite of our differences. So with that, I will turn it over to David and our professors here to tell us how it can be done. So thank you.
So good to be with you tonight. Mary, thank you as always for your expertise and your help in our understanding with reaching a higher level of acuity of vision and mind regarding the tempest that threatens the very foundations of religious freedom in our culture and in our classrooms across America. Thank you. Tonight I sit in an unenviable position following Mary Hassan, preceding Judge Ken Starr. I'm keenly aware of this predicament. And so I've invited a team of experts to join me here on the dais, who can hold their own and I believe will help us address tonight's theme. Before I introduce them, let me build on Mary's framing for only a moment and restate our overarching question for the evening. Will America's educational system continue fracturing beyond repair, or can we rebuild it stronger upon the cornerstone of freedom laid by our founders in the First Amendment? That question that really cuts across classrooms, courtrooms, and culture spins off into various iterations. A few. Why are educational institutions and teachers moving away from bedrock principles of freedom upon which our nation was founded? Why is the role of religion in society, as Mary pointed out, being marginalized, repressed, or ignored in many instances altogether in our schools? Why are those who stand in the public square not content to simply believe, but who by conviction act on their faith, practice their faith? Why are they so often disparaged in society today? Well, these important questions are being decided at this pivotal moment in the life of our nation. So let's take a few minutes tonight while we have these experts at hand, and let's unpack this evening a little more with this wonderful panel. Let me introduce them to you very briefly tonight. To my immediate left, Steve Collis. Steve serves as the director of the Beck Laughlin First Amendment Center and the Law and Religion Clinic, which was launched in the fall of 2020 at the University of Texas. Note, a state secular university launching a First Amendment Center and Religion and Law Clinic. The First Amendment Center protects the fundamental liberties secured by the First Amendment, including, of course, the freedom of religion, speech, the press, the freedom to peacefully assemble and to petition the government. Steve formerly served as research fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School. Author of several articles and books, I'll mention one by the title of Deep Conviction, a book that chronicles the history of free exercise law in the United States. Steve also served as equity partner at Holland and Hart LLP, where he chaired the firm's First Amendment practice group. Immediately to Steve's left, our friend and senior fellow at RFI, Rick Garnett. Rick currently serves as the Paul J. Sherrill and Fort Howard Corporation Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. There he also serves as the Director of the Program on Church, State, and Society at Notre Dame Law, where he also provides leadership within the Religious Liberty Initiative, which was launched in 2021. He also consults for the Alliance for Catholic Education and formerly served as clerk to late Chief Justice William Rehnquist during the 1996 term. On my far left, Dr. Larry Taylor. Dr. Taylor currently serves since June of 2019 as president of the Association for Christian Schools International, ACSI. ACSI works to strengthen Christian schools and equip Christian educators worldwide, serving more than 25,000 schools in 108 countries, helping more than 5.5 million students worldwide. ACSI is the largest evangelical Christian school association in the world. And he leads at the helm to provide assistance in the areas of accreditation, legal, legislative work, and curriculum publishing. ACSI serves K through 12, or early education through secondary education. Dr. Taylor formerly was head of school at Prestonwood Christian Academy in Plano, Texas for 20 years, also formerly president of the Texas Private Schools Association on the board of directors, developed many training programs such as Becoming a Kingdom School Institute, Student Leadership Institute, Becoming a Kingdom Family. Under Dr. Taylor's leadership, ACSI strives to place member schools on a path of growth and flourishing using what they call the Research-Based Flourishing Schools Initiative, a model that links leadership and faculty professional development, accreditation, and every culture-driving component of school. We are really fortunate to sit here with these gentlemen tonight, and I personally thank you. But let's get into the questions. Let's let them talk, because they really can shed some light, I think, on the issues we face, and in fact, what these institutions and under their leadership and these associations are doing to counter the cultural threats to religious freedom in the classroom, the courtroom, and culture. So Steve, first I'd like to turn to you this evening. I'd like you to introduce the audience generally to your work as director of the Beck Laughlin First Amendment Center, specifically the Law and Religion Clinic. But as you do that, I'd like you to answer one subpart to that question. Why the Law and Religion Clinic at the University of Texas? Why would this great state university see the need to launch a center, to hire you to direct it, and to take on that initiative?
Sure. So generally a law professor at the law school. The Beck Laughlin First Amendment Center serves the entire university. It's a university-wide center. The focus of the center broadly, so there's a distinction between the center and the clinic. The focus of the center more broadly is to promote scholarship, research, dialogue, and debate about the First Amendment and its various freedoms, including freedom of religion, but also speech, assembly, petition, and what have you, press. The Law and Religion Clinic is one part of what the broader center does. And the clinic focuses on protecting religious freedom for all. We represent religious institutions, individuals, and free exercise cases, but also church autonomy cases. We represent people from across the religious spectrum, everyone from Unitarian Universalists to devout evangelical Christians and Sikhs and Muslims and everyone in between. And we provide assistance, everything from just advising religious institutions all the way up to litigation in the Supreme Court. And we're a part of the winning decision in Ramirez, the 8-1 decision that came down this last term. So it's a great exercise, and it's just been wonderful to see the students get involved and get to participate in all these different types of work. Why this at the University of Texas? I think there was a recognition that there needed to be more discussion and education on these issues. Texas has a very robust faculty in the law and religion space generally, but in terms of the First Amendment, I think there is a generation of children growing up that perhaps this has just been taken for granted, many of these freedoms that we have in the First Amendment. And they because they've been taken for granted, they have not been explored and discussed as much as they should be on university campuses. And so, I don't have some type of a ideology. I'm not an activist in terms of the First Amendment, but I do think having robust discussion and scholarship and having students engaged in research and exploring these topics and ideas and where they came from and where they should be going and what the law should be is a crucial exercise. And thankfully, the leadership at the University of Texas and our donors, Doug Beck and Sam Laughlin, who helped fund the center, have allowed it to become a reality, and now we're just trying to move forward with it as best we can. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, it does, and we're just great. I'm a Texan, just so pleased to have the University of Texas, sponsoring this center, and with your leadership there, But it just, when I first learned of the center, it just caused me to scratch my head a little bit. And I thought, why in the world would the University of Texas be doing this? And I think it is in response to perhaps taking for granted over time that, people had an understanding of the real meaning of religion and religious freedom and its critical role in society. And yet, in some ways, we've kind of overlooked that, or we've kind of lost that emphasis in the classroom. And so I really applaud what you're doing there. You mentioned the namesake Doug Beck and Sam Laughlin, and I just want to mention parenthetically tonight that we're here tonight in large part because of the visionary of the vision of Doug Beck, who helped us launch the Center for Religious Freedom Education and supports the expansion of the center as we're undertaking it tonight. So thank you, Steve. Rick, I want to stay on the same question. I mean, here represented really in Steve, we're looking at a secular state university. Obviously Notre Dame, faith-based university, great friends of ours. And the law school there saw the need to establish the center, the Religious Liberty Initiative there. And I know you've stepped in and are helping with the leadership this year. So I want to ask you the same question, kind of tell everybody what you do there at Notre Dame, but I'd like you to respond to that same question. I mean, is this by chance that we have, the center launching at UT, Notre Dame is taking up the same type of initiative, and as you know, I mean, there are other centers springing up across the country. Pepperdine and the law school there, the Caruso Law School, has just recently, I think in January, launched their religious freedom clinic. Stanford University with James Sane, our friend, has a religious freedom clinic, as does Duke University, Harvard University. Interesting just to try and reflect on what might be the reason that these centers are kind of sprouting up across the country. And so speak to that, if you would, in light of your work at Notre Dame.
Well, I was hoping you'd start off with the contrast between Notre Dame's football program and the University of Texas's football program. But we can save that for later. No, it's an interesting institutional contrast. I'm blessed to be in an institution that, as an institution, as a community, has been committed to the foundational importance of religious freedom, to some of the moral anthropology issues that Mary was talking about earlier. That's animated a lot of what's been going on at Notre Dame for decades. And we've been a place where there have been leading scholars on these matters, both in the international human rights context and also in the domestic religious freedom context. Back when one Seamus Hassan was learning about the First Amendment from one Charlie Rice at Notre Dame, it's been continuing since then. So again, I've been really blessed to come up in an academic community that held up this question as one that was worth emphasizing, worth studying, worth trying to fire up students about. We also attract a lot of students who are committed to these questions and interested in them. So in a sense, it's natural that we would have a program like this Religious Liberty Initiative, which is relatively new. Our new dean, Marcus Cole, is passionate about the foundational importance of religious freedom. It's what he talks about the most. It's what he talked about the day he was introduced to the law school community. Someone asked the question, well, what do you want to do as dean of Notre Dame Law School? And that was his centerpiece issue, was he wanted to advance a vision of religious freedom as a foundational and fundamental human right. And he told a story to all these students gathered in the room about a time in California, where he was from, where a church had been vandalized, and there had been a statue of Christ out in front of a Catholic church, and somebody mad about something had knocked off the hands, so Jesus didn't have any hands. And they were going to try to raise money to replace this statue. And the way Dean Cole told the story, the pastor said, remember, in this world, at least for now, Jesus has no hands but ours. And Marcus said, I want Notre Dame Law School and our students to be Jesus' hands in protecting the universal right of all people to religious freedom. So that kind of vision and framing, probably can't do it at the University of Texas, but we're getting to the same place on some of these cases. So we've had, I've been running a program there for about 15 years called the Program on Church, State, and Society. And what was distinctive about us, I think, not unique, but distinctive, was that we really wanted to focus on the importance of religious institutions, hospitals, churches, social welfare agencies. And obviously the Religious Freedom Institute has been a big player on that question as well. Sometimes we thought institutions didn't get the attention that they needed in the religious freedom debate. It was easier to focus on individuals, and we thought you can't really separate those out. Individuals are formed by institutions, they live in communities. So in my academic work, in the programs work, and now in the clinic, we have tried to sort of pay special attention to the religious freedom needs of agencies like parochial schools or religiously affiliated hospitals. We represented a Coptic healthcare association that's worried about being required to participate in doctor-assisted suicide in Colorado. We've represented religiously affiliated evangelical college, Gordon College, who was trying to assert its religious freedom rights to select its own ministerial employees, including teachers. And I think that kind of focus for us is going to continue. But like Steve, our work has been, state, federal, international. We've represented people from all denominations and none, and the students have just done great work. And you ask why now? One reason I think is that law students are hungry for practical, experiential educational opportunities. And a lot of them, frankly, law schools have to just provide a more diverse array of such opportunities. This is a student demand-driven thing. They don't want to only do, great work like public housing type work or immigration asylum, which we also do. There's a demand for these religious freedom cases. So I think we're going to see more of this. I hope you'll see more of it at other schools as well.
Thanks, Rick. Let me come back and ask a question similar to the one that you've addressed, but slightly different. Some of the clinics that I've named across the country, and there are a few others, that are particularly First Amendment centers, seem to, based on my observation and knowledge, try to keep arm's length in dealing with religious freedom issues. So they're a First Amendment center, and they're willing to look at other issues and take on cases and do practical work, but maybe not the religious freedom issues. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard similar reports that at the clinics at some of these great law schools that you mentioned, that there is a little more nervousness about religious freedom cases, and that there are sort of constraints put on the kinds of cases that these clinics are allowed to do, the kinds of issues they're allowed to focus on, the kinds of arguments they're allowed to make. At Notre Dame, we've had more freedom, I think, than those schools. So, there will be some religious liberty clinics that are doing great work, but maybe they wouldn't get involved in a case involving, like I said, the Coptic Medical Association not wanting to participate in assisted suicide, or a Catholic hospital not wanting to do abortions, or the conflict between a state's discrimination law on the one hand and a Catholic school that wants to retain control over who it hires as teachers. Some clinics, I think, are going to run away from those issues and focus on other ones which are still worth attention. I think at Notre Dame we've been able to take a more full spectrum approach, which I've appreciated.
If I could just comment, you're right. If you look at many law schools across the country, what I find fascinating is they're launching First Amendment clinics, but those clinics specifically do not get involved in religion clause cases at all. Not just what might be perceived as culture war or controversial religion clause cases, but they just simply do not touch religion clause cases at all. And a lot of that comes from the funding. So there are donors out there providing funding to launch these clinics who have explicitly said, as part of the strings attached with the funding, don't get involved in the religion clause cases. I don't know what all the motivation is behind that, but I think you can probably take a guess. Part of it too is that there's a lot of people who can go out and litigate relatively run-of-the-mill defamation cases who might not have the expertise necessary to run a clinic when you're dealing with the religion clauses. So that's part of why you're seeing this dynamic at some universities where First Amendment clinics are launching, but they're really not complete First Amendment clinics. It's like a quasi First Amendment clinic, right? So.
Not sure what the founders would think about taking the religion clauses out of the First Amendment. Well, I probably am pretty certain about what they think.
Justice Scalia say Hamlet without the prince.
Right.
Yeah. Larry, let me turn to you. So similar question, but we're not talking obviously about a religious freedom clinic with ACSI, but tell us a little bit about ACSI, what ACSI is doing. What are you trying to accomplish through ACSI? And then part B to that question is, are threats to religious free exercise knocking on the doors of ACSI schools? Are you dealing with threats?
Well, I am I am feeling a little bit of peer pressure because I'm the only non-lawyer on the stage, and I'm the only one that hasn't launched a religious liberty institute. ACSI, I think you described ACSI in the introduction. Everything that you can imagine a school would need, that's what we service. I mean, we service accreditation, teacher certification, professional development, and so on and so on, all around the world. But to center on to the United States, one of our three pillars that really guides our strategic advancement is advocacy. In fact, we are one of the few, there are others, but one of the few K-12 associations that have a full-time presence here in DC. Our VP of Public Policy, George Trifiatis. Let's see, George, out here. He got stuck at the DFW airport. Sorry about that. This affects us. I mean, we are definitely in an advocacy realm. We are definitely we're trying to advocate to tell the great stories that's happening, but we're also trying to advocate to protect our space. And I might get too deep here, so interrupt me, but I would say at the tip of the spear for a K-12, there's several areas that very, very concerning, and I don't think it's any surprise to the audience. Very concerning to protecting that space of religious liberties. I mean, there's already been a mention of, you mentioned Gordon College, Dr. Michael Lindsay, a good friend of mine, and so K-12, we are always studying what's happening at the college level, at the university level, and we're learning from that. But accreditation, for example, which even was part of what Gordon College was dealing with. The secular agencies that accredit K-12, if, for example, Christian schools, talking about public accommodation, if Christian schools, for whatever reason, if we were ever put into that category of public accommodation, then obviously the non-discrimination clause, which is being, and I'll say the tip of the spear, which is primarily today the SOGI-related issues, the sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that being placed in the non-discrimination standards, then all of a sudden the Christian schools, we could find ourselves really at a point of important decision making of whether just to withdraw period from any of those accreditation agencies. It works different from state to state. For example, in Texas, and I live in Texas, the ACSI accreditation is validated by the Texas legislation validates who gets to be approved to provide accreditation. Well, the ripple effect, if a religious liberty issue dealing with, again, the categorization of public accommodation, then overnight, we know what that could happen to dealing with accreditation. The ministerial exception, We have had some victories at the Supreme Court level. Very proud of our ACSI team and organizations like ADF and so forth. But the Lady of the Guadalupe dealt with the ministerial exception. There was a victory. But we know, and that was at the, what's happening. It is now all down at the K-12 level. I mean, we are battling, and it's why we're very interested in what's happening here and what's happening at the at the post-secondary level, because it's not just accreditation. It could be that what's happening at the collegiate level, where if you're not teaching, if you're not a professor, or in our case, a K-12, if you're not a teacher that specifically teaches a religious course, then that's what's being battled in the courts right now. And so, circling back to accreditation, the importance of ACSI accreditation now and what heads of school are really dealing with is documenting and making sure that every single teacher, whether they're a history teacher, a math teacher, a science teacher, that they represent, because of the charter, because of the mission of ACSI, and I would say beyond ACSI associations, they all represent the development of faith development, in our case, biblical worldview integration. It's not just in the Bible classes. So ministerial exception, that is now down into the K-12 arena. It is totally connected to accreditation, religious liberty front, the religious liberty space, and all of those are connected to accreditation. And so we're dealing with what Michael Lindsay's dealing with. It's just at a different level.
David, can I add just one quick thing to that? Because I think it connects pretty well, I think. Part of the story of the secularization of religiously affiliated higher ed is a story about money. That is, money comes from the government, from research organizations, and it comes with strings attached. And a lot of times those strings would have implications that would cause these institutions to secularize little bit by little bit. And gradually, institutions of higher education, including my own, become very dependent on public funds. And so those strings matter. This is a good news, bad news story. In the wake of COVID, school choice programs in the United States have exploded. This is something I've been advocating for a long time. I'm a big fan. One of the things to watch for is that as more and more states adopt, as they should, school choice programs that give kids an option of choosing the school of their parents' choice, including religious schools, we can expect to see lots of efforts to attach strings of various kinds to the money that goes into these K through 12 schools. And so one can't be complacent and assume that these schools will be able to preserve their religious character and mission, their integration mission, once this dependence on voucher programs or funding sources of various kinds starts to kick in. So it's something to watch for.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you all, bear with us a little bit. I'm going to defy my boss's edict at the beginning to cut all of my comments in half. I will shorten them, but I won't cut them in half, and I'll answer to Tom tomorrow. So bear with us. I think we want to take advantage of hearing some more from these individuals. So I want to move into a line of questions that allow all three of you to get into the weeds a little bit. So just to let you know, we're going to get into the weeds for just a few minutes. Then we're going to come up for a breath of air at the end and talk a little bit more about practically what can we do about some of these things. So I want to turn back to the founders. Now, America's founders understood that religious free exercise is fundamental to a stable and flourishing democratic society, and yet that bedrock principle of our democracy is what really is under assault today. Religious belief is okay, as Mary was saying, but stay out of the public square. So, Steve and Rick, I want this question to go to both of you. I want to focus for a moment on a case at the Supreme Court that all of us are familiar with, the Coach Kennedy case, Kennedy versus the Bremerton School District. And just basically, in that case, Bremerton High School initially suspended and then fired Coach Kennedy for kneeling and praying in public sight at the 50-yard line after football games. The U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington and then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals both sided with the school district, and the case came up on appeal in January of this year. And then, as we're familiar with the fact that the oral arguments, I think, took place just a week ago Monday. So we're living and breathing this question. Well, religious belief is okay, but maybe not in the public square. And that case kind of brings it all to where we are today with those questions. So I want both of you, Steve, you kind of launch in first. I think both of your religious freedom clinics submitted briefs to the Supreme Court on that. So we've got two experts here. They had their students plugged right in, submitted briefs to the Supreme Court. So I want, give us your thoughts. Just let's not get too long, too deep in the weeds on this, but Steve, your thoughts on that case and maybe what you would think might be the outcome, the ruling.
Yeah, sure. So this might be perhaps a minority view in this room, but it's a minority view for different reasons at my institution. So, but you know, I don't think the case is particularly easy or obvious to me. I think these are difficult questions, trying to figure out what is the limit to which a coach or a teacher can push religion onto their students, and how do we draw those lines? And those aren't easy lines to draw. I am of the view that the Establishment Clause is very important, and it protects religious freedom if properly applied. This case for me was difficult. I've gone back and forth on it. When I first learned that Coach Kennedy was giving religious-laden speeches in the locker room, praying in the locker room in front of kind of a captive team, and then giving religious-laden speeches at midfield, that troubled me. And in my view, I felt like that was probably crossing a line that is an Establishment Clause problem. But then when I learned that Coach Kennedy had backed off from that and agreed to stop doing that, and what he was really asking for, if you read the complaint and you see what he was really asking for, what he was asking for was to be able to kneel down and pray by himself in a private prayer. I don't know if private in terms of other people could see him, but he wasn't asking to give a public open speech. He wanted to kneel down, say a prayer, 10 to 15 seconds, and be on his way. At the end of the day, that's where the case settled. And to me, I felt like that is a form of free exercise that public employees deserve to be able to engage in without saying that it violates the Establishment Clause. So the arguments we've made to the Supreme Court is, first of all, that for the last century or so, they've largely botched Establishment Clause jurisprudence. And what they've done is created a world where I don't think public employees or their employers really know what the limits are regarding how public employees can exercise their religion. And so you have a school district who's relying on tests that are confusing. You have a public employee who doesn't really know how they can exercise their religion and when. And it's created, in my opinion, mass chaos. And this case reflects that chaos. There's just no clear rule here that the court has provided over the years. Our argument is that the Ninth Circuit relied on a faulty rule, which is this idea that when public employees engage in their exercise, if it appears to be an endorsement of religion, that's a violation of the Establishment Clause sufficient enough to suppress the person's religious exercise. Our argument is that's the wrong rule, and you can look to our neighbors to the north if you want to see why. In Quebec, they were so worried about this idea of public employees being perceived as being government endorsers of religion that they forbade any public employees in most jobs from wearing any type of outward clothing or garb that would reflect their religion, for fear that it would appear that government is endorsing religion. What that means is that if you're a Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, a devout Christian who might wear a large cross, you can think of all these different things, you can't serve in almost any public capacity in Quebec for fear that you might be perceived as government endorsing religion. So our argument to the court was, we think that's the wrong test. We think that's an absurd outcome. You need to be looking at whether or not there's actual coercion of students, and it's not enough in our opinion that a student might feel coerced. We think there actually needs to be evidence of coercion. So if there's evidence that the coach is praying students might be around him and he's giving those students more playing time, I think that's evidence of actual coercion, something like that. That's the position we took in the case. People whom I respect greatly have taken other positions, and that reflects in my mind that it's not just an obvious, easy outcome one way or the other. But that's kind of my take of the case, and I welcome disagreement or other thoughts.
I think you put it really well. Like your clinic, our kids put together a brief under the supervision of some of my colleagues. Francesca's here; she helped work on this. And what we did in our role as amici, friends of the court, is we really tried to focus the court's attention on just how unhelpful and useless the so-called no endorsement test has been. So we had a little more freedom because we're not representing the coach. We can, we don't have to win the case. We can just get our issues out there, right? So that was our focus. This test that was kind of conjured up about 40 years ago has created confusion in the lower courts, and we had I think, really funny lists of all these, sad but funny, kind of weird outcomes where a lot of times local officials, they just don't want to get sued. They don't know what the rules are. The uncertainty creates overreactions by litigation-shy school districts, and what suffers is the religious exercise, often of kids in public schools. So it's important to be clear what this case is not about, and I think Steve did a good job of reminding us this. This is not a case about whether we're going to undo the 1960s decisions that say you can't have state-sponsored and state-composed prayers as part of the curriculum of public schools. This case has nothing to do with that. As it was litigated, it wasn't really about coercion either. That wasn't the claim that was originally made. There was no evidence in this case of any such coercion being applied. If there were, that's illegal. I think we all agree. The way this case came down is that Coach Kennedy, I went to Duke, I'm sorry. Coach Kennedy was disciplined because he didn't want to comply with an order that said you can't engage in any religious expression or activity in view of students. And that in view of, if you think about how dramatic and broad that would mean a teacher couldn't, cross herself before lunch in the cafeteria, or you have to wipe your ashes off your forehead on Ash Wednesday or something. And so the theory of the case as it was actually litigated was we had to fire the coach because otherwise people would think we were endorsing his prayer. And on that theory of the case, we think the coach should, and I think will, win. And if I have just a couple seconds left, there's another case that came down just a few days after that oral argument out of Boston, which involved religion in the public square also, and also involved confusion about the so-called endorsement test. Some of the justices took pains to sort of point out, and they listed some of the cases from our brief about this confusion. So that might tell us that things are going to go pretty well for Coach Kennedy.
And if I could just emphasize, the risk you have of allowing this no endorsement test applying to public employees in this is you end up with a world, this goes back to Mary's comments, you end up with a world where children in public schools look around at the adults in their lives, and the only ones they would see would be those who have no religion, who don't have any need to outwardly express their religion, or the kind of people who have been kind of cowed into silence regarding their religion. That doesn't prepare them for going out into a pluralistic world where there are people who take their faith very seriously. And it seems to me there's nothing wrong with having children grow up in a world where they see their school teachers who do take their faith seriously actually exercising it. Again, if it becomes coercive, I think that's a real problem. But they should be able to exercise, public employees should be able to exercise their religion in a way, and the rest of us can learn to live in a world where people who have different religious beliefs than us are exercising their religion, and we are okay with that. And we would expect the same back from them, right?
Well, that's really helpful analysis, and especially shedding light on the coercion test and how that was so applicable in the understanding and the arguments to the court. Larry, let me shift down to you. One kind of question in the weeds, and I'm going to blame you for opening the door because you went into accreditation. I want to ask a question on that, and then we're going to come back and ask one kind of final question. I want to ask a question primarily for those that are educators in the audience tonight, what advice can you offer to faith-based and other private school administrators or educators that are concerned about this critical education requirement of accreditation? There really does seem to be a lot of concern about that. And there may be some here tonight that are in schools, private schools, faith-based schools, where they're feeling that tension and that threat, and you're dealing with it. And what advice could you offer tonight on that?
Probably the most important advice I could give any educators, and not to be sermonic, is in our faith and Christian faith, there's nothing, there's no reason to be fearful. Let's not lead out of fear, but let's also be prudent. Let's not be ill prepared. My advice, and I'll use ACSI Association standards or mission statement, is we're going to try to protect our space, obviously, but we are going to be 100% committed to advancing specifically accreditation standards. That credential is very important in acceptance into universities, but it's not the only, an accredited school, that's not the only credential that is the gateway to whatever university, faith-based university, public university, whatever. So my advice is pursue excellence now. Pursue accreditation, but codify, document. 4 or 5 years ago, I was a head of school, and so everything that we did as far as accreditation, we filtered it through the legal affairs of ACSI as well as some other legal filters, and made sure that things were codified and at least as prepared as possible in case we ended up in a situation where, like some of my colleagues out in California, when the California University school system would not accept, and this ended up in the courts, would not accept anything on the transcript of a student, anything that taught anything about creationism. That science course was just not accepted by the California University system. So our advice is don't stop teaching that. We have to lean into this. We have to be prudent. We have to have things documented and codified so that it really does show that we're very clear in our commitment to faith, whatever that faith is, that it's very clear. And if the accreditation, for whatever reason, like I said earlier, the tip of the spear today, I don't think it's the only thing we're dealing with, but the tip of the spear for K-12 and probably beyond is everything related to the SOGI issues. Front and center, and not to sensationalize this, but front and center is the transgender issue. That was, front page on every paper, cycled front page. That's happening at the K-12. It's not just happening at the Ivy League Penn University. It's happening everywhere. And so how we, again, going back to accreditation, how we document, how we train on the different standards, very clearly. We've been very surprised at when we're looking at our schools, when we have a visiting team that goes into a school to accredit, we've been very surprised at how far behind a lot of our schools are in truly documenting all the different standards and how it is attached and strategically and intentionally linked to our faith and our orthodoxy. And so that's my advice. You know, our advice is continue, but not blindly. We have to be wise. We have to have, you know, gentlemen like this and organizations like this that help us in K-12, but also not to be fearful. Not to be fearful. You know, we will continue, and I don't say that haphazardly, but we will continue to live out our faith, and we will continue to grow and increase access to kingdom education for K-12 as that space gets attacked. And again, forgive me if I focus so much on the LGBTQ or the SOGI issues, but that right now in K-12 is 90% of what we're dealing with that could lead to anything dealing with accreditation. That is the tip of the spear. And sexual ethic policies, rewriting those sexual ethic policies that are linked to accreditation. They have to be as strong, as clear, and codified as if we were going to be going through a review legally. But stay committed, stay consistent, and be prudent in the whole process of teacher certification and accreditation.
Thank you, Larry. You really answered what was going to be my final question, and I thank you for doing that. I wanted to ask, what do you see as the most prevalent and foreboding issue on campuses, K through 12 and higher education? And I think certainly some of the issues that you brought to light with moral orthodoxy, basic principles of anthropology, these issues that we're wrestling with in culture that have spilled over into the classroom and are really threatening, basic quality of education, accreditation, things of that nature, and issues that are going all the way to the Supreme Court, based on these threats in culture. So as we close, I want to make a statement, for all of these individuals. I mean, they have really helped us tonight. They're continuing to help us think about how do we use the classroom and educational tools to reshape the cultural narrative around these key issues to support fundamental principles of freedom upon which America was founded. And that's why the Center for Religious Freedom exists. That's why we partner with these leaders here at the Religious Freedom Clinic at UT and at Notre Dame and with ACSI. We're really working together to try to figure out how do we use the classroom and educational resources to return the basic teachings, fundamental principles about religious freedom back into the classroom and back into culture. So give a hand of applause to these gentlemen tonight. Well, we're going to wrap up tonight by hearing from our closing speaker. So I want to introduce a man that needs no introduction, Judge Ken Starr. He's had a distinguished career in academia, the law, and public service, currently of counsel to the Lanier law firm based in Texas. Ken also has served as president and chancellor of Baylor University, dean of the Pepperdine School of Law. He continues to teach law, write articles of interest on religious freedom, and serves as a commentator for Fox and various radio programs on which we all see him frequently. He serves on the board of Advocates International and the Christian Legal Society, as well as the advisory board of Alliance Defending Freedom. Throughout his professional career, he has championed the cause of religious liberty and freedom of conscience for all persons. He's argued 36 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, including during his service as U.S. Solicitor General. He has served in the United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit, Counselor and Chief of Staff to U.S. Attorney General William French Smith, and law clerk to both Chief Justice Warren E. Burger and Fifth Circuit Judge David W. Dyer. He was appointed to serve as independent counsel for 5 investigations, as you know, including the Whitewater investigation from 94 to 99. Authored many, many books. His most recent, as far as I know, unless he's got another one out that I've missed, but as far as I know, Religious Liberty in Crisis, published in April of 2021. So, Judge Starr.
Thank you, David. And is it great for us to be here at the launch? How about a round of applause for the launch of this great national initiative? And what a rich discussion we've already had. Tom, thank you for those wonderful reflections about the nature of religious liberty. Mary, what an uplifting and yet dispiriting reflection on the culture. Take us back to 1994, back to when there was this great consensus. Now, I realize I'm the last thing standing between us and the reception. No, not you, us and the reception. So, as Henry VIII might say to one of his, and did say to one of his many spouses, I won't keep you for long. I know, I should not mention such a tacky man or subject here. But I think tonight's program really represents a symbolic union, a partnership of education, but also advocacy. But education and advocacy, as Dr. Taylor has been so eloquent in reminding us, very practical, with practical wisdom. We're to be Aristotelian in being very prudent in the way that we go about our work. And I suggest that there are 4 factors, very briefly, that make this a very propitious time, the why and the why now. And the first is a broader cultural factor, and that is the collapse of civic education in the United States. It's not my description, it's the description 20 years ago of Sandra Day O'Connor. Justice O'Connor was shocked by what she found when she would get before civic groups and school groups and so forth. There had been not since a decline, but a collapse of understanding, including of the America's founding. Woeful ignorance. Does this say something in terms of these baleful cultural trends? Her views were echoed in one of the last public speeches that David Souter gave as he was leaving the court and being asked to reflect on his service, including an elective office in New Hampshire. He said this, I don't believe that there is any problem in American public life which is more significant today than the pervasive civic ignorance of the Constitution of the United States and the structure of government. And we would, of course, add of the understanding of our first principles and of our first principles. Pervasive ignorance. Mary's citations to what has happened in the culture and the attitudes of Generation Z are so dispiriting. Well, let me not cheer you up. Get a load of this. The Annenberg Public Policy Center at USC, in a recent study, found that only 26% of Americans can identify the 3 branches of government. That seems appallingly almost impossible to believe. A U.S. News survey found recently that about 2/3 of Americans would not pass the U.S. citizenship test. Collapse. Education is needed. Related to civic education, Gallup polls reveal that there has been shocking changes in the number of young people who do not believe in a market economy, another dimension of freedom. What we're talking about is a culture of freedom that arises out, as Tom so beautifully put it, of human dignity. The second factor that I think brings us to this moment of the why now is a deep and continuing misunderstanding culturally of our constitutional order. It's a part of this broader issue of pervasive ignorance. And there are reasons for that. One of them, Mr. Jefferson's famous metaphor of the wall of separation. We need education to explain, yes, the wall is necessary to protect religious institutions from the intrusion of the state. Ministerial exceptions allow the church to choose not simply its clergy, but those who propagate the faith. This is terribly important. What an important part of the educational enterprise that is. This profound public understanding or misunderstanding was evident as recently as Monday at the Supreme Court when and reference was made to this, the city of Boston. The city of Boston got a unanimous wham defeat at the Supreme Court of the United States in the flagpole case. Where were the lawyers? Well, they were reading Mr. Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists as opposed to reflecting on first principles. The city had rejected a Christian flag on the basis that we're having to comply with the Establishment Clause. So the misunderstanding of what the Establishment Clause provided, it led in a concurring opinion Justice Gorsuch to ask, how did the city get it so wrong? My friends, again, there were a number of opinions, but this is a unanimous judgment that the city had violated the Constitution by discriminating against the Christian flag when it was willing to hoist for celebrations secular flags. Well, I think that leads to the third factor. See, I'm already on factor 3, and there are only 4. There is hope. But again, here, education is vitally important. And that is, there is some bad constitutional law still lurking out there. It marches through the streets and does mischief. Although overall, and Mary noted this and others have noted it, the Supreme Court has been a good friend of religious freedom. Religion clause jurisprudence has been vexed by 2 extremely bad decisions. Many of you know the decisions, Lemon versus Kurtzman and its 3-part test. It continues, as Justice Scalia said so poignantly and colorfully, like some zombie getting up from its grave and marching and frightening people, and then it gets back in its grave. Lemon is not in the ascendancy, but it causes confusion. We need education. Again, Justice Gorsuch in the Boston case in his concurring opinion. Lemon has long since been exposed as an anomaly and a mistake. Well, we need to now spread the good word, the happy word. Lemon lives no longer. Maybe it's still on the books, but still, the role of education. The second, and it grieves me to even mention it, is Employment Division versus Smith. General laws of neutral laws of general applicability don't come to the judges to ask for a freedom of conscience exception. Even Homer nodded, and so did Justice Scalia in that case of Employment Division versus Smith. But it likewise is being rejected. It's being applied, however. It's being applied in the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case by the lower court judges. It is a danger, the role of education. There is, in fact, a need to, Mary, I loved the way you put it, shine the spotlight. And that's what the center is going to do, especially with those issues that Dr. Taylor, you mentioned, and both Stephen and Rick have talked about the important works of the clinic, showing the marriage of education and advocacy, being out there in the trenches to defend this very fundamental freedom. But I close with the sober observation that, as Mary so powerfully put it and others have referenced it, and that is the culture has turned so hostile. And that's where the vision of RFI is so important. That freedom of religion, both not simply to believe but to act, is entirely consistent with human flourishing. And the failure to provide a regime of religious liberty results in human impoverishment. And social science is indicating that which we know. But freedom of conscience is now the issue. Dr. Taylor, you flagged it. And the work of the Notre Dame Clinic and the University of Texas Clinic likewise confirms. This is where the problem is. And if there is any issue in which there is such a dire need for education, it is with respect to the foundational nature of freedom of conscience. Given such beautiful expression by Justice Robert Jackson in his iconic expression and articulation of it in the flag salute case in Barnett versus West Virginia Board of Education. This is what we need to educate. We need to have our school children, K through 12, at least when they're old enough to memorize that passage of if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is this, that no official high or petty can determine and demand and impose and coerce, Steve, the coercion principle, anything with respect to politics, nationalism, religion, and the like. This is who we are, but we have forgotten as a people who we are. It's not just Generation Z. The American people are suffering from a lack of understanding, which is attributable to a complete collapse in the educational system of the United States. Happily, RFI and the center is here to shine a very bright spotlight, and that is a cause for happiness, for celebration, and for Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Eric Patterson, and I serve as the Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute. And I was so happy that Judge Starr reminded us about memorizing things. And so I'd like to end us tonight with Schoolhouse Rock. You know, we haven't talked much about children. So I'd just like for you to think for a moment about actual kids, your grandkids, the students that you know, your own children. And the reason for the establishment of the Center for Religious Freedom Education is to touch children and, of course, to train the people who come alongside them. And we can do that. The center has very practical programs, a virtues curriculum for K to 6 kids that'll come out next year, a 8th grade curriculum on religious freedom, a beautiful little study guide on religious freedom and the Mayflower Compact. We have tools for homeschoolers. We have tools for parochial and private schools. We have tools for high schools and beyond. Let me just ask you this. Two points of inspiration from Schoolhouse Rock. If I were to say to you, I'm just a bill, yes, only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. You know it, right? You know that bill sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill. It's a cultural marker. We have plans like that for the center. Do you remember this? I bet you could sing the rest of that. The point is this, Judge Starr said it. We need to be training, memorizing, taking to heart the Declaration, the Constitution, the key religious principles of our faiths that Mary talked about. And we have a practical plan at the National Center for Religious Freedom Education, not just to fly high, not only to work with college and university students and professors, high school teachers, but all the way down to kindergarten. So I'm so delighted that you joined us tonight. I hope you'll stay after to talk to this panel and to others about some of those very, very practical ways, from storybooks to videos that were going to impact the next generation and those who form them to not just defend their faith, but to defend the religious freedom of everyone, everywhere. Thank you, and good night.